Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome Cees Withagen this afternoon for this sweet seminar. I replace Lionel Rago, who unfortunately couldn't be with us for this session. However, I will try to do my best. This afternoon, the seminar will be on carbon capture and storage with enhanced recovery. This paper has been prepared by Jean-Pierre, Amigues, Gerard from den Meijden, Michel Moreaux, and Cees Withagen. On this point, the paper has been prepared with Michel Moreaux, and this is the occasion to have an affectionate thought for Michel, who left us a short time ago. Also, now says the floor is yours for 45 minutes. If you have any question of comprehension on the paper, you could send a short message in the chat and I will translate or transmit to Cees, and after we will have a quarter of an hour of discussion. All the microphone will be open at the end. Cees, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you for your invitation and for your kind words by way of introduction. This is a paper called Carbon Capture, Storage versus Utilization. And my co-authors are Jean-Pierre Amigues, Gerard van der Meijden, and Michel Moreaux. We started this paper a long time ago, several years, when Michel was still with us. And while writing this paper, unfortunately, he passed away. He was a very good friend and also an excellent scholar from whom I learned a lot. So I'm very grateful to be able to be in his presence for many, many years. This is the outline of my talk. I will give an introduction, then I will present a model. In first instance, a rather complicated model, but I will simplify. And then, it says here that there are preliminary results. It means that the paper is not yet finished. We are trying our best to finish the paper in 2 weeks, and there are still some things that need to be resolved. That's why I call the results preliminary. I will say something about the market economy, something on the social optimum, and I will compare the two different outcomes of the model. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. So I guess you know what this is, and there's an important agreement in Paris several years ago that we would strive to get no more than 1.5 higher degree. And carbon capture and storage is going to play an important role in achieving that goal. Here you see that the thick black line is one way to reach the 1.5 degree budget. And you can see in, for example, here in the emissions avoided through fossil fuel and industry, that there is CCS, that's carbon capture and storage. Also, when it comes to agriculture, forestry, and land use, there is carbon capture. It's the brown line under there. And there is also carbon capture and when it comes to biofuels, that's the lower part. So we see that in order to reach the Paris goal, carbon capture and storage will play an important role according to IPCC. So therefore, it's important to pay attention to carbon capture and storage from an economic perspective. So the questions that we want to answer are the following. Can we kill two birds with one stone? And the idea is that we can use carbon capture and storage in two ways. We can reduce carbon emissions, that's one bird that we want to kill, but at the same time, we can wonder whether we can use the carbon that is captured to increase the recovery factor of fossil fuels. In fact, can we lower extraction cost of fossil fuel? So that's an important question that we want to address. We then want to make a distinction between just carbon capture and storage, which is in this paper meant to be storage in inert, non-active resource wells, and carbon capture and utilization, or sometimes called also carbon capture and use. And that is the enhanced recovery of oil or gas by means of injecting CO2 in active wells. So what is the effect of this CCU on the extraction path of fossil fuel? What is the effect on cumulative emissions? Where should we store this carbon? So the question is, should we do it as a utilization or just store carbon in inert and non-active wells? What should the government do to achieve the goals? Can the government stimulate carbon capture and utilization? And if so, for how long should this be done? And of course, we want to know also how the market outcome differs from the social optimum, because this will guide the government in designing its optimal policy. Here you see an example of carbon capture and utilization. So you see the red spot is natural gas, and natural gas is then extracted, and it is used to produce electricity. But at the same time, the CO2 that is generated in this process of use is really reinserted in the gas well. Okay, and that means that the pressure in the gas well goes up, and that means that it's becoming easier to extract natural gas. One could also use CO2 that is captured from coal-powered plants. So that's the plant that you see here. So it's not necessarily the case that we have to use CO2 from natural gas to reinsert in gas wells. So an important role in this is played by Darcy's law. And Darcy, maybe I should say Darcy. Darcy was a French engineer who was the boss, the manager of the fountains in Dijon. And what we learn from Darcy is an important law. It says something about the relationship between the pressure in a well translated into fossil fuels, in the pressure of a well, and the ease at which you can extract fossil fuel from that well. So this French engineer has played an important role also when it comes to carbon capture and storage and utilization. What has been done in this field so far? Well, there are two applications. First of all, enhanced oil recovery. So that's CCS in the oil industry. And there is EGS, EGR, which is enhanced gas recovery. So first, we can see from this picture that there is a kind of exponential growth in CO2 capture capacity for oil. And for gas, the picture is less optimistic. So far, there are only simulations and laboratory studies, and some people argue that this appears to be promising, but there is a problem because CO2, for example, CO2 is denser than CH4, which is also a greenhouse gas, and then the CO2 will tend to migrate down relative to CH4. The potential in terms of numbers, Hepburn argues that 90% of global oil reservoirs is potentially suitable for enhanced oil recovery. Enormous amounts can be stored, and they give a guess of the price that is needed to make enhanced oil recovery viable. Oldenburg comes to other numbers, and he looks at depleted gas reservoirs. There's not so much recovery. And Godek talks about the enhanced gas recovery in gas shales, and he comes to 280 gigaton. I must say that there are also people who are very critical with regard to these optimistic numbers. One famous professor at Princeton, Jacobson, he says that there is a lot of problem with this enhanced gas and enhanced oil recovery, because in the process of the recovery is very expensive. So that could be a reason for us to refrain from going further. But well, we also want to know at which cost enhanced oil or gas recovery is feasible. So we don't have definite statements about whether this process should go on or not, but we just take an impartial view and want to find out what arguments can be given in favor and in the contrary. Some economists have worked on this, but that's dating a long time ago. Cairns and Davies, Leach et al., Amigues, and Van het Veld et al. In 2013. So this is already a long time ago. I must say that Van het Veld et al., they also refer to the Darcy's law. But we will take another perspective than these papers, and I will show you right now. So what we have is a model, and in the model we can compare market and social optimum, and that's also what we are going to do. We take into account exhaustibility of fossil fuel, and this is a novelty. Normally it's assumed that fossil fuel is plentiful available, but we assume that there is exhaustibility of fossil fuel. There is carbon capture and storage in various forms. So we have storage just in inert wells and storage in active wells. We look at capturing at point sources only. So we don't look at geoengineering, which is kind of capturing CO2 from the air. So this is not what we are looking at. We also work in line with let's say, Michel Moreaux's preference, but also according to the Paris Agreement, we work with a carbon budget. So that means that once you go over the budget, there is a catastrophe. So it's something that is suddenly giving something very bad, and that makes things easier for us. Whether this is completely realistic, I have some doubts about it. But for the time being, we look at the carbon budget. And we assume that the temperature increases linearly in cumulative emissions. So here is, let's say, a graphical representation of the model. Don't worry about the symbols because they will change anyway. But we have a stock of coal, a stock of natural gas, and a stock of oil. And we have a stock of CO2, denoted by S. Then coal, gas, and oil, they give utility, not as a stock, but as a flow. And there is also the possibility of using renewables. And they give, together, they give utility. However, the use of oil and gas and coal also leads to CO2 emissions. And we assume that there is a constant proportion of these energy inputs that lead to CO2 emissions. Then these CO2 emissions, they lead to a higher stock of CO2. But we can also use CO2 emissions to put them in inert reserves, so non-active reserve. And this is going to be the number B, or the variable B. What is then coming into the atmosphere is the difference between the total generation of CO2 and the amount put in inert reserves and the amount going back into the oil wells or gas wells. So that is then the atmospheric CO2. So this is the, let's say, the general picture, but we have to modify this and make it simpler. And we therefore restrict ourselves to just one type of fossil fuel, denoted by X. And the flow is denoted by lowercase x. Together with renewables, this gives utility. Zeta X is the generation of CO2 emissions. B is going into inert reserves. And zeta X minus B minus S is emitted into the atmosphere. So S, the lowercase s, is the amount of CO2 that is reinserted in the fossil fuel well, whether it's oil or gas. So we work now on a high level of aggregation. We are aware of the fact that the techniques for insertion are different across coal and gas and oil. But for tractability, we assume that we have only one fossil fuel source. Okay, so once again, B is inserted in inert wells, S is inserted in active wells, and we say that there is full carbon capture and storage if all emissions find their way back to inert wells or active wells. There is no carbon capture and storage if these insertions are equal to 0. We will show that there will be full carbon capture and utilization if all X is used in active wells. So B is equal to 0, nothing goes to inert wells, everything goes to active wells, and there is no carbon capture and utilization if S is equal to 0. So once again, CCS refers to inert wells, and S refers, CCU refers to active wells. Then we have to introduce some notation with respect to time. So there will be a final phase with only use of renewables, and that phase starts at Ty, so that's the beginning of only Y, so then we are in the carbon-free economy. The stock left at the stock of oil or gas or fossil fuel in general left at that moment is denoted by XY, and the Z bar is the upper bound on total atmospheric CO2. And this becomes binding, let's say, at capital TZ. So that's the moment at which this becomes binding.
Please, Cees, there is a question in the chat from Aude. Why assuming fossil fuel exhaustibility as a carbon budget will be more constraining?
Yes. Well, this is to find out how much oil is going to be left. So it's not that we will show that the oil stock or the gas stock will be fully exhausted, but it is finite, and we want to know how much will be left in the ground. Okay? So we start with a finite stock. So in that sense, it's exhaustible. The initial stock is finite, but some will be left. Okay, and many of the, so because we have stock-dependent extraction cost, it's important not to assume from the start that the initial stock is infinity, because then maybe the stocks are the costs are very small. Okay. Okay, so a possible picture would be as follows for the stock of atmospheric CO2. So we could start at time 0 with the initial stock. Then we could keep it constant, for example, by using utilization and not using insertion in inert wells. Then we move up to the ceiling, to Z bar, in the interval TS, TZ. And then from that on, we have, for example, only insertion in inert wells. And then at some moment, renewables take over. So the question is, what is the optimal sequence of these activities? And also, what is the market going to do? Okay. So what we assume in the sequel is that in an optimum, the constraint on atmospheric CO2 will be binding. Okay. Otherwise, the problem is not so interesting. If it's not binding at all, then then we will not have to use CCS. Okay. So here is the set of equations that we are looking at. So Z is the stock of atmospheric CO2. It increases with the use of fossil fuel. A factor of proportionality is zeta. A dot above a variable means the derivative with respect to time. A is abatement. And you cannot abate more than what is produced. So that means also that we don't have geoengineering. Carbon capture is A. It brings along a cost, which is convex, and the function that is representing this is Ca. Then the captured CO2, A, is used in inert reserves, B, and in fossil fuel reservoirs, St. We assume that it's costless to inject this in inert reservoirs just to make things easy. And there is a convex cost Cs of S of injection of CO2 in fossil fuel reservoirs. And the stock of CO2 in the fossil fuel reservoir is denoted by capital S. So S dot, capital S dot, gives you the increase of CO2 in the fossil fuel reservoir as a consequence of inserting CO2, captured CO2 in that well. So here we have the fossil fuel reserve. It declines according to the rate of extraction. And then an important aspect here is the unit extraction cost, which is given by H of X plus alpha S. So X is the stock of fossil fuel, and alpha S is a measure of the pressure that is caused by insertion of CO2. So X plus alpha S is the total pressure in the well. So we assume that the high, and this is based on Darcy's law. So we assume that the higher the pressure, so the higher the sum of X and alpha S, the lower is the cost per unit of extraction, and we assume that it is convex. Okay, so now you could maybe think of lowering the cost by inserting more and more CO2. This is something we are going to exclude. So you know that the increase in H, the increase in the extraction cost, depends on the increase in X and the increase in alpha S. So as the increase in alpha in S is at maximum lowercase s, which is equal to zeta times X. So we assume that alpha times zeta is smaller than 1. So you cannot make things cheaper by inserting a lot of CO2 into the wells. I can check this. I will check this. And there is utility derived from fossil fuels and renewables. And they are perfect substitutes, and there is convex production cost of renewables. Okay, so we want to find out the optimum in this economy. So we want to maximize social welfare consisting of utility minus the extraction cost of fossil fuel, minus the production cost of renewables, minus the abatement cost, minus the injection cost into active wells. And these are the conditions that we have to satisfy. So this is the definition of the increase in Z, the increase or decrease in X, and this is the increase in the inserted amount. And we must make sure that abatement is non-negative, and there are many other non-negative variables as well. So you see that we have 3 state variables, which is a bit frightening, because I've never succeeded in solving analytically with more than 2 state variables. So we will also take care of this. So we have the necessary conditions, and let me briefly go into explanation of these necessary conditions. I will try to refrain from them, but it's maybe good to give some intuition. So suppose we are in optimum and we increase the use of fossil fuel. Well, this yields extra utility. Rho is the rate of time preference. So E minus rho T U prime X plus Y is the extra utility that you gain, but you have to extract this from the resource. So this is a cost, H of X plus alpha S. Moreover, if you extract today, you cannot extract tomorrow. So there is a rent that you have to pay, which is the shadow price of fossil fuel. And there is the cost of increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere. And tau is the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon is just the extra cost in terms of utility by increasing the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then the other 2 have to do with the condition that there should be no negative abatement. Okay, so you see here that the social cost of carbon is just equal to the marginal abatement cost, apart from this mu, which is in fact the willingness to pay for a relaxation of the condition that you see it here, that the total amount of CO2 cannot be decreased. Okay, so these other conditions are hopefully can be explained in a similar way as this one, but given the time, I have to move on. So maybe just for S, if we increase the amount of CO2 in a well, this will bring along some abatement costs and insertion costs. What is the revenue? The revenue is the shadow price of inserted oil, and you don't have to, let's say, you don't have to pay the social cost of carbon because this CO2 is now inserted in this active well. Okay, so there are some transversality conditions. And as I said, it's very difficult to solve this problem in its generality. So we rely on specific functional forms. We take a linear extraction cost, linear abatement costs, and quadratic utility, etc. So what we then find is that due to this, mainly due to this linearity here, there is no simultaneous use of fossil fuels and renewables. So you cannot have at the same time oil use and wind energy use. There is no simultaneous injection in inert and fossil fuel reservoirs, also due to this linearity. I hope I convince you. And if there is CCS, so if B is positive, then there is full CCS, meaning that all generated CO2 will be inserted in inactive wells. The same holds for utilization. If there is utilization, then it is full utilization. Okay, and in the final stage before renewables take over, there is only full CCS. And the proof is in the paper, and it's a long proof. So let's see what the market economy is going to do. Well, the market economy is for sure not going to use CCS. Although it's free, this market economy doesn't care at all about the carbon budget. So this economy will not use CCS. It will not lower, unnecessarily lower the amount of CO2. But it will use carbon capture and utilization, because that will decrease the cost of extracting fossil fuel. Okay, so we have now 3 phases in the market economy. The first phase is where you have CCU, then a phase where nothing happens in terms of using renewables or inserting. So then there is only an increase in the stock of atmospheric CO2. And then at some instant of time, renewables take over. So let me give you the picture. So depending on the cost of abatement and insertion of CO2 in active wells, you get the following pictures. If there's high, if the costs are low, there will be a lot of extraction. If the cost is high, then there will be much lower extraction. There will be capturing of CO2 in the economy. So not the B is equal to 0, but S is going to be positive. And you see that if the cost of abatement and of storage are low, then there will be a lot of insertion in active wells. Here you see the cumulative emissions. So but high, they start immediately, but with the low cost emissions will be zero for a long time. And this is also corresponding to the inserted stock. Then the social optimum has in principle 4 phases. One phase is CCU. The second phase is accumulating atmospheric CO2. And in that phase, there is no carbon capture or storage, nor carbon capture utilization. Then a third phase with only insertion in inert fields to keep the stock of CO2, the atmospheric stock of CO2 at a constant level, and then renewables take over. And it's nice maybe to sketch what is going on in this by means of this picture. It looks very complicated, but it's not so complicated. This is initiated by Michel Moreaux, who likes very much to have the total, let's say, the total picture in the phase or in the diagram where we have initial stocks on the axis. So on the vertical axis, we have the stock of inserted CO2, and on the horizontal axis, we have the stock of fossil fuel. And what we can do, we can depict in this picture the CCS frontier. So what we can do, if you go back to this picture here, what we can do, we can assume that Ts is equal to 0, and also that Tz, that Ty minus Tz is equal to 0. So it means that we are not going to use CCU, and we are not going to use CCS. So for what stocks is that an optimum? Of course, we know that is going to be an optimum if the initial stock is very low or relatively low compared to Z bar. Okay, and this gives us a relationship between S and X. So this is the CCS frontier. It means that if we are to the left of this frontier, there will be CCS. If we are to the left, sorry, if you are to the right, there will be CCS. If you are to the left, then there will be no CCS. And we can have the same type of frontier for CCU. If you are to the left of this frontier, there will be some CCU. If you are on the left, sorry, if you are on the right, there will be CCU. If you are on the left, there will be CCS. So for example, if we start at this point, denoted by X0, S0, okay, so that means that S0 is large and also the initial stock is large. So it means that we are going to use CO2 to insert into the oil wells. We are a rich economy, so we're going to use it in to reduce the cost of extraction of oil. So we move into this direction until we arrive at the CCU frontier. Then it's over with CCU, and we are we should be at the start of going up. And so here the stock of CO2 is constant because we are compensating all CO2 emissions. And then we are going to increase the stock of CO2 during this period of time to reach to exhaust the budget. And from there on, we have CCS until at some instant of time, we move on to, we leave some oil in the ground, and then we move on to renewables. If we do not start to the right of the CCU frontier, then we start immediately with using the carbon budget here. And then after exhausting the carbon budget, we use only CCS. If you are to the left of the CCS phase curve, then we only exhaust the budget and then nothing will take place anymore. Okay, so if the stock is low, then we need the entire stock to exhaust the budget, and then there is no stock left to use further injection into inert wells. However, these two frontiers can also be located differently. So we can also have the CCU frontier below the CCS frontier. And then the picture changes a little bit. And but if you are to the right of this, if we are far here, we indeed have, again, a CCU phase, then we exhaust the budget and we stop. Okay. So in this situation here, if we start here, then there will be, the stock is very low. So we will then only use, we only exhaust the budget. We still have to find out what exactly determines the location of these frontiers. And that's something we are now working on, first numerically and then later on also analytically, if you have a feeling for which way it goes. So here you see some pictures for the extraction rate, depending on the extraction cost and the abatement cost. So this is for low cost, we have high X. Here you see S. So for low cost, we do a lot of S and so on. Maybe given the time, I have some pictures to compare the outcomes. So you see that in some circumstances, the market and the optimum do not need to differ very much. Okay, so these graphs are relatively close, but I should say this is just an example. It is not really calibrated, so we still have to calibrate the model to real world data. Here you see what the optimum is doing. So the market stops inserting CO2 into active wells, but the rate at which these wells are filled is about the same as in the social optimum, but in the social optimum we go on a little bit further and we stop a little bit later. Okay, we don't use CO2 to insert in inert wells, but we do use it in the optimum. Okay, total emissions, yeah, that's of course a big theme. We see that the market, although it uses carbon capture and utilization, that the market just goes far beyond the carbon budget, which is given by this line. Okay, so the conclusion reads that the market uses CU in the beginning. If the costs are not too high, we can identify the cost for capturing and storage, at which there is this divide between the two. CCU lowers cumulative emissions, so that's nice in both cases. And the social planner uses CCU in the beginning and CCS in the end. And in the optimum, CCU is longer than in the market. We need a tax on net emissions in order to reach the optimum. And we would like to go back to strictly convex cost functions. We would like to introduce more types of fossil fuel, because coal and oil and gas, they have really different properties that are not taken into account here. And we still have to do some work on calibration. I think I should stop here. So a lot of work to do, but we are enthusiastic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cees. I guess that's now it's time for questions and exchange. Also, please raise your hand before you ask a question or you give some comments. I don't know who want to start. Aude.
Aude.
Yeah, in case there is no question, I can start if it's fine for you. So my question.
Oh. No, so now it's you can see Aude if you want.
I can.
Yeah.
Voilà.
Here you are. Are you in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, I'm pretending me being on a boat. Yeah, so thank you very much for the presentation. That was really super clear, and it's really inspiring to see this work on CCU. I had a question on which assumption is responsible for some of the results, mainly the fact that you use only CCU at the beginning and CCS at the end, and you don't use them together. Do you expect that it's going to change if you have convex cost functions?
Yes, sure.
I was wondering, I mean, what is responsible for that result?
Sure. If we now assume that the marginal cost is bounded from below, and if you have strict convex CCU cost or strict abatement cost, then strictly convex abatement cost, then, well, if you do it in a quadratic way, then the marginal costs are zero when you don't do any of these activities. So then, if the marginal cost is equal to zero, you will surely have simultaneous use of the two options, CCU and CCS. So it makes indeed a big difference, and that's why I also say when I talk about further research that strictly convex cost functions is something that we should address in future work. But you know, the paper I skipped many of the proofs, but I know we are already at about 40 pages, including the proof. So, and I'm sure that with strict convex cost functions, everything will be even more complicated. So for the time being, I think we just want to finish this paper and then make some idea, give some idea about what is going to happen if we have strict convex cost functions. But of course, I think that numerically it should pose not so much of a problem. But you are completely right, it will make a difference.
So I had another one, if I have still some time. So it's related to the question I asked during your presentation. So I understand it's nice to know how much fossil fuel you keep in the ground, but it's making your life very difficult to have this additional state variable just to have something nice to say about how much you stay in the ground. And in particular, you don't have a calibrated model, so I don't know how much information it really provides. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, so the point is that the initial stock is important because we assume that the
cost.
Yes, for the per unit extraction cost depends on the initial stock. If the initial stock is very high and you have a linear per unit extraction cost, then if the cost is if the stock is very high, then the cost of extraction is equal to zero. So we need some initial value.
There is no way to have this inside, because then I understand that it's very interesting to have the CCU because it reduces your cost, but there is no, I mean,
maybe you
really have to have this additional stock. I mean, I think it's probably really complicated the model, but I do understand this feature that you.
Yeah, but you're right. I remember that we had discussions with Michel and Jean-Pierre about the way to interpret Darcy's law, and we took a linear specification, and we are aware of the fact that this is well, not very realistic, but it's also very helpful. So we are aware of this problem that you put forward. But any suggestion is very welcome.
I know, but yeah.
Yes, thank you. Is there some other question? No.
I've been too clear.
It was very, very clear. Yes, there is one. Yes.
Hi, Cees.
Hi, Donk. Hi, how are you?
Good, good. It's great to see you, and it's great to see this great work. And but I was planning to say a little bit more on the fossil fuel reserves. Sorry about that, but I understand the point of including it. So it's depending on whether it's too big or not. This resolution is changing. But I have, you know, there is this issues with even when you do calibration, you will encounter issues concerning unproven reserves, you know, potential reserves. So they change all the time.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to really come up with the right numbers there. So that's what came to my mind.
Do you then suggest that we should introduce uncertainty on stocks?
Uncertainty may be difficult in this case, but I think a nice sensitivity analysis there would maybe give you some strong hand.
Yes, yes. Okay, we will do that.
Great work. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any other question for Cees? In fact, by hearing you and from this discussions, there is this question about uncertainty on the reserves and uncertainty on the cost, also on the specification on your cost function, on the convexity of your extraction cost, which would be, I guess, also join all the elements which have been discussed, which would be very nice to have a sensitivity analysis, because in fact there are some places in the world where there are some very large reserves with some huge uncertainty on the cost that we could have.
Yes, thank you. And maybe there is another source of uncertainty. I understand that CCU or CCS is even forbidden in France because many citizens are very much opposed to it. Also in the Netherlands, we had an experiment not far from Rotterdam to insert CO2 in the ground, and then the local population made a big protest out of it, and then the experiment was cancelled. So as a policymaker, you really have to take into account the behavior or the attitude of the people who may be affected by this, because, well, personally, I don't mind so much, but, you know, there have been pictures about fire coming out of taps and so on, and so people may be scared. So it's important also to give the right information and to be clear about the possible problems. So that's another thing that we do not take into account, and it should be taken into account.
And we could have an increasing cost due to the distance that we would like to have with the storage reservoir.
Yes.
That we accept.
Yeah, yeah. It has to be absolutely safe, you know.
Yeah.
May I quickly ask something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. When you talked about countries, I just realized one thing that may be nice to see in the future work. You know, nowadays you hear a lot about hubs and clusters when it comes to CCS, which means that, you know, you have actually several parties which can, for example, store jointly in a common storage place. And then this is going to be shipped somewhere for permanent storage, etc. So maybe a nice thing would be to consider countries who doesn't have natural gas, for example, who doesn't have any resource, but who wants to get rid of CO2 by, for example, transferring it to this storage place. So then you have like two different countries, and one can store, both can utilize, but you know, so it's interesting. I don't know how things will change, but it's also relevant actually when you see the ongoing things about CCU and CCS.
Yes. Well, your story applies to CCS, not to CCU, because then the one country that has the fossil fuel will insert it in its own active well. Okay, so
yes.
So in order to make this problem interesting, you probably need one fossil fuel well where you cannot insert, and you need an inert well in another country where you can insert. Or do I misunderstand you?
So, so in this case, one will be for sure using fossil fuel, but has no place to store. So it may actually use this inert storage place, but I don't know where it is. I didn't think about it.
Okay.
But for enhanced oil recovery, it's going to be this country with the natural gas extraction. So, I mean, there will be several scenarios there for sure.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because if one country has gas and the other country has oil, it's generally more difficult or more costly to insert in gas wells than in oil wells. You have much more experience with oil wells than with gas.
True, right.
So that might be an interesting extension.
I should have said oil. I should have said oil in the beginning. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, also, I guess that now we are at 5 o'clock. It's time to close this session. Also, once again, thank you, Cees. And the next suite seminar will be on March 15 with Guy Meunier there. And also, we meet us in 2 weeks. Okay. Thank you, Cees. Have a nice afternoon for everybody. And we meet us in 2 weeks.
Frédéric, can you put me on the list of attendants?
Yes, you will be added.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, au revoir.
Bye-bye.
Bye.